Hi guys, I Aziz welcome you to CoedMaster. In previous video we learned what scope is, what are LHS, RHS lookups and how scope actually works. Now in this video we are going to learn what are the different types of scope in JavaScript. So let's talk about what we are going to learn in this video. So we are going to start this video with a quick recap of what scope is. Then we are going to learn about global scope, function scope and block scope one by one. In the last, we will see what scope chain is and how it works. So guys, I highly recommend to watch the previous video before continue to watch this video. So without wasting any time, let's get started. Alright guys, so let's have a quick recap of what scope is. So in previous video, I showed you two definitions which says scope is the set of rules that determines where and how a variable can be looked up. The second definition says it's a set of rules that governs how the engine can look up a variable by its identifier name and find it either in the current scope or in any of the nested scope. So let me explain the concept of scope in a very layman term. So you can think of scope as a container which allows us to store a variable and then retrieve the variable when we need it. As simple as that. Now moving on to next slide. So let's start this video with a first scope which is a global scope. So you can think of global scope as a largest container which is available to us. So whenever we declare anything on a script level, everything will be stored in a global scope, which is why it is accessible to all the code in the program and we can modify the global scope from anywhere in the code. In front of you, you can see the script.js and in this script I have returned a variable with the name global variable and a function with main function as a name. So when the engine executes this script, the global execution context is being created and along with that a global scope is also created. So as we have defined the variable and function on the top level of this script, it is going to store in a global scope. And then if we want to retrieve this variable, we can simply call console.log and the name of the variable. As it is defined in a global scope, we can access this variable anywhere in the program. This is the beauty of global scope. Now, despite the fact that global scope is convenient and very flexible to use, but sometimes it comes with a lot of issues. So let's talk about this issue one by one. So as we are dumping everything in the global scope, we end up writing a code which is more susceptible to unintended changes and conflicts. And as we have everything in the global scope, we end up writing less modular and unorganized code, which is why it becomes extremely difficult to maintain the code. Now the question over here is how to avoid these issues. So in order to avoid these issues, we have some recommended best practices which we are going to use to avoid those issues. So let's talk about best practices one by one. So the first best practice is we should always declare global variable when we genuinely need it. We should always declare a global variable when we actually need it. So we should always think about it before declaring a global variable. The second thing is we should always be cautious when modifying global variables to prevent unintended side effects. And the third best practice is when we declare a variable, we should always take a special care when naming the variable. We should always name a variable which conveys their purpose. It must be a descriptive name. Cool. Now we know that what global scope is. Now let's move on and see what function scope is. So as the global scope is the largest container available, the function scope is a smaller container which is nested inside the global scope. And as the function scope is nested inside the global scope, we can only access the variables and function declared in the function scope within the function scope only. Okay. So here in this script you can see that I have defined my function and inside that function I have defined a local variable and the local function. Now if we access the local variable and local function, we can only access the local variable and local function within the scope of the my function. Right? If we try to access the local variable and local function outside the my function scope, the runtime or the engine will yell at us and it will throw an error. Because the function scope works in isolation, and whatever we define in the function scope is confined within the function scope only. So we cannot access anything outside of the function scope. So what is the benefit of using the function scope? So there are many benefits. So let's talk about all the benefits one by one. So the number one benefits we get by using the function scope is the isolation. So when we organize our code in the function, we end up writing a more isolated code, which help us in reducing the risk of bugs and conflicts. As the code is more isolated, no other code from the program can modify or edit or change the behavior of that code. The second benefit is the modularity. So as our program grows and grows more, we end up writing more modular code, which becomes very easy to maintain and manage. And the third most important advantage is reusability. So when our program grows, we end up writing a lot of redundant code, but we should always collect all of those redundant code in a simple small unit and use a function scope to wrap it up so that we can use that code elsewhere in the program without affecting the rest of the program, and which promotes the code reusability. So instead of writing redundant code, we are collecting all the redundant code in a single unit and then using it everywhere in the program, which also help us in maintaining the program efficiently. So far so good. Now let's talk about the block scope. So block scope is somewhat like a function scope only. So you can think of it as a smaller container which is nested inside the global scope or function scope. So you can think like a series of nested boxes within a larger container. So whatever variables we declare in the block scope are confined to that block only, which offers a high degree of isolation. And how we create a block scope? It is created when we define the if-else statement, switch cases, for loop and while loop. Now let's see this block scope in action. So in this script I have defined if statement and while statement, and in both the blocks I have defined two variables, and the name of two variables is block variable. Now if we want to access this variable, we can only access this variable inside the if statement and inside the while statement, right? Because whatever code we write inside this block is confined to this block only. We cannot access anything from the if statement and while loop outside of their scope. So you can think of it as a larger container which is a global scope, then we have a smaller container which is a function scope, and then we have a more smaller container which is a block scope. So now we understood that what is global scope, what is function scope, and what is local scope. Now we have scope, but sometimes we have a nested scope. Now, so what happens when we have a nested scope and we want to try to access the variables? So let's understand this piece of snippet. Okay, so when we execute this piece of script, first of all the global scope is going to be created, right, which is associated with this script. Then when we call outer function, one scope is created for the outer function. Then the outer function is going to call the inner function. So one dedicated scope is created for the inner function. And then you can see that one variable is declared inside the inner function, which lives in the inner function only, which is confined to inner function only. So when engine search for the inner variable, it finds the inner variable inside the inner function only and it prints it on the console. When engine finds the outer variable, it fails to find the outer variable in the inner function scope. So it goes one level up, it finds that outer variable is available there and it's going to print on the screen. Now when it times to print a global variable, the engine first look for this global variable, the RHS lookup happens, it looks for the variable inside the inner function, it fails, then it moves one level up, then it searches for the global variable in the outer function, it again fails to find the global variable. Now then it goes to last scope, which is a global scope, and then it finds the global variable. So once it finds the global variable, it gets printed on the screen. So this is how the nested scope and a scope chain works. So as you can see, we have multiple scopes over here. One is the global scope, then we have a scope for outer function, then we have a scope for inner function. So we have three scopes which is nested inside each other. And then when we try to access the variable inside the innermost function, then the engine checks for the variable in the innermost scope, then goes one level up, then finds, and then goes one level up and then search. So it starts from the innermost scope and go up until the global scope. And once the variable is finds, that's okay. If it doesn't find, then the search will stop at the global scope. So this is how the scope chain works. So that is pretty much about different types of scope in JavaScript. Alright guys, this is all from my side for this video. If you learned something valuable from this video, then please hit the like button in order to make YouTube algorithm happy. Please subscribe to this channel and don't forget to click the bell icon so my friend you never miss any upcoming videos. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.